Welcome to another episode of the Weatherwise podcast, where we answer the whys and what's weather. I'm your host, Ed Oswald. Since this is our first episode of the new year, Happy New Year. Have you ever wondered what all the fuss is about when it comes to the polar vortex? Stay tuned because that's what today's episode is all about. A once boring way to describe the behavior of cold air at our planet's poles has quickly become a part of our winter lexicon: the polar vortex. The mere mention of it on the evening news brings a sense of dread to some. But there's also a lot of hype too, so we wanted to give you the facts. A polar vortex refers to a persistent area, or more accurately, areas of low pressure that rotate around both poles. The polar vortex keeps the coldest air locked up in the Arctic during the winter, but can be disrupted by something called sudden stratospheric warming. It sounds worse than it is. These events are actually a fairly common atmospheric phenomena, and is a process where the stratosphere warms suddenly, causing the stratospheric polar vortex to weaken. When this happens, the westerly winds that blow around the poles in the stratosphere weaken and can reverse direction in the strongest events. Scientists classify warming events into two categories: minor and major. In a minor event, the typical stratospheric westerly winds found at the poles weaken but do not completely change direction. The polar vortex is disrupted but not displaced, so weather effects are limited to higher latitudes. However, in a major event, these polar winds reverse direction entirely, disrupting and occasionally splitting the polar vortex in two. Weather is affected in the mid-latitudes, where a majority of the human population lives, often featuring bitter cold. While minor events occur several times a year, major events rarely occur more than once every 2 years. While more than one major event can occur in a single season, it's extremely rare and can amplify the cold to historic levels. So what about all these videos on YouTube right now hyping the cold that's about to come? Keep this in mind. While we understand how the polar vortex operates, there are differences in opinion on how it affects surface weather conditions, especially during weaker events. However, during most major events, Arctic air is pushed into Siberia, often propagating into North America and Northern Europe. This makes a set of conditions fairly likely if the polar vortex is disrupted so that cold air is pushed southward towards the United States. For us, this typically means very cold and dry conditions, but in Northern Europe the cold is often accompanied by increased precipitation and storminess. Places like England and Ireland see increased snowfall, which usually occurs about 2 to 4 weeks after the warming event. But there have been major events that have not resulted in those expected conditions, or where the polar vortex is merely disrupted and not dislodged, resulting in little effects in the mid-latitudes. Add to this that weather models cannot model the stratosphere with the same accuracy they can at the surface, and our ability to forecast these events is limited. Furthermore, the concept of stratospheric warming only came about in the 1950s, so we don't have a lot of data to work with either. So yes, the polar vortex is coming, and yes, it's probably going to get really cold. But at the same time, there's a lot of fun winter activities the cold makes possible, and it's a perfect time to catch up on all that stuff you've been putting off since the holidays. Weatherwise is a production of the weather station experts and the Weatherwise Company. Today's episode was produced by Derek Oswald and myself from our studios here in West Lawn, Pennsylvania. If you'd like to learn more about Weatherwise, please visit our website at weatherwise, that's WHYS.show. Our website has links to this episode and past episodes. We'd also love to hear from you. You can email us at podcast@theweatherstationexperts.com. We may respond to your comments in a future podcast. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Again, thanks for listening, and as always, stay weatherwise.